Welcome to It's a Good podcast.
My name is Hayden.
I'm Chris.
I'm Harry.
And yeah, we're just a bunch of guys having talks about theology, the Bible, and God. And basically our whole goal is just to be accessible to anyone, that you don't need a theology seminary degree to be able to talk about God. We want to make it easy and simple.
I definitely don't have any of those degrees.
Yeah.
That's so true, though. I mean, you just have to be interested in it. Mm-hmm. All the information's out there.
All right. Well, here we are once again. I'm excited for this. So when we started the podcast, which I was going to look it up how long ago it was. So let's see if we can just look it up real quick.
What was the
first one
released?
came out on March 4th, 2019.
Wow.
So we are literally, a month away from being a year.
It's crazy.
Into
we should do
this
something
thing.
special.
Yeah, we should do something special. Let us know what we should do to mark our 1 year anniversary of It's a Good podcast. But but when we started, we were going like pretty topically, and we basically started from the end and went to the beginning as far as like theological topics go.
Yeah.
So we like started with resurrection, and then went to death, and then salvation, and then hell, and then creation, and then sin, and then we kind of worked our way back up. But I think that was good, and we had a lot of benefits from that. But I also think we've come a long way in this 1 year of our time, and now we are gonna kind of have the opportunity to flip it back the other way and start with Genesis. So
maybe what we should have done all along is start with Genesis.
Yeah,
Well,
but
I don't know.
I kind of like starting, because the place we started from is a very, like, those are very typical questions people have.
Yeah.
And, like, I think for the most part, people don't really think about Genesis.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously some people, it's a really big thing that they can't, that they haven't processed, but I think for a lot of people, it's just kind of like, Genesis, it's the beginning, and then Jesus is like the most important part for Christians.
So we started with the clickbait, and now we're getting into... now we're getting
we
into-
hooked them.
and now we're going to Genesis.
Haha, gotcha.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'm really excited. I think part of the reason why covering Genesis overall, as well as its parts, is important, is because Genesis sets the groundwork for all of the biblical verbiage that you're going to be using for the rest. So I feel like probably in our podcast, we are just using some of these terms and using some of these metaphors and like using some of these concepts willy-nilly, just
Without
expecting
explaining
people to kind of be there. And so I think taking a step back and like looking at Genesis is going to be really good and hopefully helpful.
Yeah, and then I think we've kind of firmly made Jesus the reason, the purpose of our podcast. And we've said before, like, if you want to understand what Jesus is saying, you should probably read the Old Testament, because that was his Bible, and that's going to kind of be the codex for a lot of the things that he's saying, if they're confusing you. And if you want the codex for the Old Testament, that would be Genesis. Genesis gives you the keys to the kingdom to then understand why and how everything else is explained in the rest of the Old Testament.
That's totally true. We went through a book with our small group. What was that book? It's like the Human Story or something like that.
I could look it up, but it was basically a study,
The Never-Ending Story.
It's the Never-Ending Story. It's a study book done by a professor somewhere in New York, but on Genesis, and just looking at Genesis.
The Universal Story.
Yeah, that's it.
Nailed
Universal
it.
Story.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty good.
I thought it was good too, and I think he really illustrated what we're trying to say right now. And basically what he said is Genesis 1 and 2 are a base narrative from which Genesis 1 through 11 pull out more theology and more story. And then the rest of Genesis takes Genesis 1 through 11 and what they've pulled out, and they tease it out even more. And then the rest of the Old Testament takes that and pulls it in 100 different directions. And then the New Testament grabs the whole thing and like yanks it into a new context. And so his point is, if you haven't embedded yourself in Genesis 1 and 2, and particularly Genesis 1 through 11, you're really not going to be tracking too much with what's going on, because the Genesis 1 through 11 is what he calls the universal story. It's like the story of God and humanity, and the rest of the Bible is pulling on that to talk more specifically or in different directions.
But it's still the same story told over and over, just with slight differentiation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make, and I think also it's kind of setting the stage for everything. It's like your foundation, and so we know what to expect from all the books following, because everything should be pointing back to Genesis.
Right.
It just, for clarity's sake, the guy's name is Dr. Drew Johnson, if that interests you.
He wrote the universal story.
He wrote the never-ending story, which is now a major motion picture.
Amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, and part of that, so when you're reading the rest of the Bible, like you are, so we've talked about this, and maybe this is a good place to go back to again, though, is the Bible, and particularly Genesis, is meant to be Jewish meditation literature, or it's written from a Jewish mind or Jewish minds, in a ancient Jewish context. Obviously we would say inspired by God, but the way that they wrote it is in such a way that it doesn't just give you all the answers, it doesn't just give you every detail, but you're expected to read, reread again, and every new stage of your life is going to, and every context of your life is going to inform and bring new questions to the story. And so you meditate on it by asking questions of the text and then inserting your own story and talking, seeing how it lines up. But then when you have that bed frame of Genesis 1 through 11, really ingrained in your mind because you've been reading it and rereading it, you're going to see patterns and you're going to see themes that are going to get expanded on, but then also like shifted and changed throughout the rest of the Bible. And so when you're like, oh, this happened this way in Genesis 1 through 11,
right,
and the same thing almost happened in Exodus 20, but then they flipped it just a little bit. That's when you're supposed to say, well, why did they flip it that way? And
I think like what you're saying is to knowing that it's intentional.
Yeah, exactly.
Like looking at Genesis, and anytime it's ever repeated or mirrored, going, there's a reason it's slightly different. It's not a mistake. And like that's a really interesting tension to be in, right? Yeah. Knowing that Genesis is confusing and sometimes ambiguous, and it's supposed to be that way.
I also feel like most people, if not all, especially just like Americans reading the Bible, they're kind of almost set up to fail. Like, I would highly recommend finding some guidance before just like hopping in and reading it.
Oh yeah.
Because number one, it is this meditation literature that's not supposed to be clear upon the first reading.
Right.
But number two, it is a thousands and thousands of years departure in what we expect literature to be. So, like, we read it and we think of, like, chapter 1. Okay, I'm going to meet the main characters, and then, like, they're going to introduce the plot, and then there's going to be a love triangle, and then there's going to be a resolution at the end. Like, that is not, especially, like, that's not what the Bible is, and that's especially not what Genesis is. Yeah. So,
have you guys ever read a book like that? Because as you were speaking, I remember the first time reading Fellowship of the Ring, and I was so bored in the first 100 pages.
Yeah,
because all it is talking about the backstory of the Hobbit,
introducing.
And I didn't care at all. I was like, get me to the battles. Like, I want to know how this resolves, where the problems are. But they don't, like, they give you a little bit of that, but it's really about, like, I mean, J.R. Tolkien's all about character building, so that's what it was about. But yeah, you're right. Like, we're set up to fail because we're expecting so much from the first chapter, the first page.
Well, maybe books is like a bad example. Like, maybe we think it's supposed to be a movie where it's like, like fast paced. 20 minutes in, I know what's going to happen,
Sure.
and then the actual drama unfolds. But that's a good point that you make too, because like the best books that I've ever read are the ones where straight up for like the first 100 pages I was like, when is this book ever going to start? And then something hits and I'm like, oh, and then it gets awesome. So like, if you want to read the greatest story ever told, it's going to start with maybe 50-ish chapters of like really, really hard to digest information.
Yeah, like I wouldn't say, it's boring. Like this is a pretty big deal in the beginning.
I mean,
but it's not like we expect where there's characters we can like latch onto and identify ourselves with.
There's no excitement either. Yeah. It's mostly not at the surface level anyway. It's mostly just like information provided to you.
Right.
And that's the other thing. It's like this was supposed to be read. Like, I don't know if you can give some historical context, but like you're supposed to be like a Babylonian reading this, right? Like you're supposed to be like an ancient Egyptian or something like that reading this with a whole set and framework that like we don't have. So like it's like, you've given that example before, where if you were gonna say, "I have a dream," like for us three, we're gonna be like, "Oh, like Martin Luther King said that." Like, when you say that, it sets the scene. It like makes us think all these things in our head that like color the story already before you've even said anything else. We have none of that context when we're reading this, so like it would start out and it would have so many different phrases that I think would mean a lot to that group of people, and like it just falls blank in my head.
Yeah, I know you know a lot about that, and what's always stuck with me is like what you're saying, but also as Americans, for most of Americans, like this might be the only creation story they ever hear.
Yeah,
like and to them, for a lot of Americans, this is just a story. That's fine, but even like for their framework, like that might just be it. Like that might be this, and then like their Big Bang might be their origin story that they might know, but also like that's not really an origin story. So it's like a lot of people don't have anything to compare this to. When in reality, when this was written, I know Hayden can speak more into it, but this was pulling a lot of things from other cultures and showing like, and it's not saying that this is unoriginal. It's very original in who God is and like the power that one singular God brings, and just even the way He created the world. It wasn't out of chaos or disorder. Well, no, it was out of chaos, but it wasn't out of war, which a lot of other cultures do. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Hayden.
There is an important social context that this is being brought into as part of a theological discussion going on. It would be like if all of a sudden the Green Party emerged in like a weird minority voice into U.S. politics, and it started using phrases like "Make America Great Again" or like
change.
Started saying stuff that Bernie Sanders was saying and pulling from rhetoric from Elizabeth Warren or whoever else.
Sure.
But then spinning them in such a way to be like, but we're actually thinking about this all wrong. We need, they start quoting the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and stuff like that, and kind of harking us to a different view of democracy. Like that would be, but we only understand what they're saying because when they say, 7 years ago or whatever, like we know the context that they're applying, and so there's a lot of that in Genesis that we just miss, and that's why I think what you said, Harry, is important. Like, get some guidance on how to read this. Like, get out a devotional plan. Right now I'm going through the Bible Project's The Bible in a Year plan, and they put their like devotionals in there alongside of it, which is basically just their videos. But their videos do such a good job of painting a whole picture of what's being said throughout all the books, and then also when you're like, what is the deal with this term? They like laser in on some of those terms.
So 2 really important bullet points that I think we should highlight, just sort of like in summary of what we just talked about. Number 1, Genesis provides the metaphors, the phrases, the design patterns, as Tim would call them, that will enlighten the rest of the story. It'll make clear certain phrases and why they're used throughout the rest of the biblical story period. Mm-hmm. Number 2, Genesis, and specifically Genesis 1 and 2, it's a origin and creation story given to a much different culture at a time where there were multiple creation stories that everybody was very familiar with, that meant a great deal to them because it explained why they were there and what they were there for.
Yeah, I think that's really good.
And not something that I think like 15-year-old Harry would have known at all, or would have cared to have known. I would have been like, that's not the Big Bang. Shut this book. I'm like,
yeah,
it's that's not what it's there for.
It's so interesting too to look at it and go, okay, this is the very first book of the Bible is already requiring you to know things that we have no business knowing.
Yeah.
Like it's assuming that you know about like Babylonian origin stories or something.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of where it's coming from.
Yeah.
So to like get help, like you said, is so important because it's not like you can't just sit down and read it. Like you're not going to hurt yourself if you do that.
No.
But you're going to miss so much. Yeah. And like if you really want to start to understand the Bible, you should start to try to understand with Genesis. If you want to understand the Bible as a whole. Like if anybody came to me and they didn't have time to get somebody to teach them how to read the Bible or anything, I wouldn't say don't read it. Mm-hmm. I would just say maybe start in a book like Matthew, where you might still miss some stuff, but you're going to get the point.
Yeah, and you said that before. You were like, start them in the Gospels, right? Because like I feel like a lot of people turn to the Bible of their own accord for enlightenment or for truth, feeling better, and if they open up to page 1 and start reading, like I would immediately be discouraged. I'd be like, this is a bunch of mumbo jumbo. It makes no sense. Like pages 1 and 2 disagree with each other. Like I don't like this book,
Sure, and it's not even really like. I mean, we talk a lot about like why was this book written or like the purpose of this book, and I'm not saying that doesn't apply to Genesis. It absolutely does, but the purpose of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is to tell about Jesus, and for a couple of them is to persuade you into believing about Jesus.
Or different groups of people.
Right.
Yeah.
So like why not start with one of those if that's what you're seeking? Mm-hmm. Whereas Genesis is, once you understand Genesis, like those books are going to make a whole lot more sense and be a lot deeper, but you don't have to just start here.
Yeah, that's totally true. And kind of circling back to where we started also, we were saying the Genesis 1 through 11 gives you a framework, and then motifs and metaphors and things are played out and tweaked and kind of elaborated on throughout the rest of the story. And I think that can make it sound like what we're saying is this is all like creative poetry or something like that. And so I want to say there's a mix. Like there's historical and real evidence that like Abraham, Isaac, Joshua, Jacob, Moses, like that these were real people. Like they did exist, at least for the most part. We can talk about Adam and Eve, whether or not they existed. I think there's different reasons and why I would say maybe no or yes. As far as Noah goes, because again, I think Genesis 1 through 11 is kind of its own beast. But just because there are metaphors and motifs and things that are being played out doesn't mean that the stories aren't true, but it's being told from not like a first-hand perspective, but from someone who's sitting back from the events, telling them in such a way not to change their value, but to enhance their value and let you see the big picture alongside the small story.
That's something super important to say as well. And like, that's not, I think, something we should talk about today, right? But there are many different types of literature in the Bible. There is poetry, there's narrative, there's straight up history, like where Chronicles is just like, let me chronicle history. There is apocalyptic literature, which is like its own area. Like there's a lot of different types of prose. There are proverbs, which is like kind of poetry, kind of not. So like, there's so many different types of literature in the Bible. Genesis, in and of itself, like there is debate on like which pieces are which, but you should at least have that perspective when you go in as well, because what it's not a science book. That's not what it is.
That's not what it's trying to do.
Yeah, it's
And,
not.
like,
It's not a biography.
all of these different forms of literature, again, we probably shouldn't go too deep into them, aren't like, they don't weaken the Bible, they strengthen it,
Yeah.
and they enhance it, and they give us like a beautiful picture. Like, poetry exists because we don't think literal words do enough. Like,
Right.
that's the reason poetry exists, and that's why people love poetry and songs and all of that style of writing. And so just because something's in poetry doesn't mean it's weakened.
Yeah.
Right.
It's actually strengthened because of it.
Yeah, I can think of two kind of examples to further explain that. It's like the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Like, that didn't happen. That did not happen. And like there's a lot of I've read multiple biographies of George Washington. It's like that was kind of like a tall tale, but like that doesn't mean that George Washington didn't exist. He lived, and that also doesn't mean that George Washington wasn't a very trustworthy man. Like, he was a very trustworthy, honest man.
Yeah.
It's just like that was one way of telling the truth. Another way is just like metaphor in general. Like, I could say like, I'm trying to think of a good metaphor, you know, like I could say like I'm a live wire, you know, like I could say, you know, but that doesn't mean that I actually am. We're using a metaphor. We're almost using something that is not true to explain a deeper truth.
Right.
With so many words or not, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's what I'm trying to say here is that Genesis 1 and 2 and Genesis 1 through 11 are giving you a metaphorical dictionary, and saying these are stories that have created language and metaphors that will be used throughout the rest of our context, because they're the ways that we speak as ancient Israelites. We in the United States have tons of metaphors that we live by. There is a book called Metaphors We Live By. If you're interested in this,
that goes so deep.
Yeah.
It's so freaking deep.
Yeah, and it's super interesting, but it's true. Everything that we talk about is in metaphor.
Pretty much.
We
Pretty
don't
much.
really realize it, but even like the scientific things that we talk about are metaphorically given. Like, if you're a science teacher in high school trying to explain things, you have to use language, even though the science is basically all math.
Right.
You know what I mean? So you can't just go up there and be like, atoms are 1.739 times 2x.
No one's gonna understand
You know,
what you're
like
saying,
that
yeah.
makes no sense.
You're like, they're the building blocks
Yeah.
of molecules, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so,
Yeah.
again, what we're not saying, oh, Genesis 1 through 11 is all metaphor, and so it's not true.
Yeah.
Or Genesis 1 through 50 is all metaphor, so it's not true.
That's
That is not what we're saying.
yeah.
We're saying, in order to understand the language that is being used in Genesis and in the entire Bible, you've got to pay attention to the metaphors that they are giving to us,
Repeating over and
especially-
over and over.
Yeah, and especially in Genesis 1 through 11. And man, we are lucky that we have Genesis 1 through 11. Otherwise, we would just be seeing these as stories and be missing out on that whole metaphorical dictionary, because we'd just be thinking in our own time is money American, which, you know, so that's one of the metaphors that we live by.
Time is money.
Yeah, money. Like, oh man, I spent a lot of time today doing chores. Oh man, I wish
I could save a lot of time
Yeah,
if I went this way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is time currency? Do we have the ability to spend or save it? Like, no.
No.
But that's the way that we talk, because it makes sense to us in
Sure.
our economy. So yeah, I think that's one thing. The other thing that we said is that this is written outside of a first-hand perspective, and written by people later on in Israel's history. There wasn't a scribe next to Abraham writing down his words. And that might sound scandalous.
I was gonna say that is pretty scandalous, you know,
Yeah.
because there are probably still a lot of people that stick with the tradition that Moses wrote all of Genesis.
But even if you say that though, like, but there's scholars on both sides of it, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, the people that hold to the tradition that Moses wrote them down, Moses would still have had to have visions in order to know what to write. Right? He wasn't there for creation. Like, we know that.
He also dies.
Yeah, Moses dies, and he can't write about himself after he's dead.
Yeah.
So yeah, even if you are in the most traditional view, you would still have to say this is coming from. It's not a first-hand account.
Right.
Yeah, and so this is not an extra biblical idea either. What I mean by that is there is evidence for this in the Bible itself. So I just have an example pulled up. This is Genesis 26, 32, and 33. And we're talking about Isaac, and it begins in 32 saying, "Now it came about on the same day that Isaac's servants came in and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, 'We found water!' So he called it Sheba, which probably means we found water. And therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba to this day."
There's a lot of those little Easter eggs.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Isaac has some servants. They've been trying to dig wells. They've been digging wells. They are coming up dry every single time.
Yeah.
Eventually, they find a well that has water in it. And they're like, "Rejoice! We've found us water." And so Isaac rejoices. He's like, "We're going to call this place Waterhole." And so they do. And then in verse 33, he calls it Waterhole. Therefore, there is a city there that's still there to this day. And guess what? It's still called Waterhole City.
Yeah. And so, like, once again, if I'm reading George Washington's biography, or Abraham Lincoln's biography, and it's like, and we named this city Lincoln, and it still stands to this day. Like, if I was reading that in a vacuum or like 1,000 years from now, I would still be able to somehow have some context of, okay, there was this place, and in 2020, people lived in it, and it might be like around then. Like, there are these Easter eggs, these little clues of who and when wrote this story, because they put them in there for you. And like that's not the only one.
No, there's
where they're
one,
like,
that's just
and
one
this
example.
place still stands up until this day. Like, or that's why we call this place fill in the blank.
Yeah, two things. First, Sheba means oath, or the number 7.
Oh,
so
cool.
But bear, B-E-R, means well, or E-E-R, like beer. Means well. I don't know if there's any correlation there. But second thing is, I completely agree. But also, even if if you realize all of these stories are first oral tradition as well, you have to kind of realize that there's time between the oral tradition and it being written down.
Right.
So no matter what you do, it can't be firsthand because it's been passed down, and this might have been included later. Like maybe originally it didn't have anything to. It didn't say, and we still call the city this to this day.
Right.
That might have been, hey, I'm telling you this amazing story, and that city that you know as Beersheba is actually the same city.
That's something else really important to mention too, is that like these written accounts that we're reading today that are the same every single time when we read them, translations aside, like for probably even longer, they were just oral traditions. Like they were specifically passed down mouth like by word of mouth. It was not written down probably for much longer after they told these stories a zillion times, generation over generation.
And again, that doesn't make it weaker. That actually is the reason we still have it. Because there are plenty of times where the Jews have been conquered, like by the Babylonians and stuff. And if they had written all this down, it would have been burned. If that was the only access they had to it, they would have lost it.
Yeah,
like the oral tradition is why it's preserved.
Let's let that blow our minds for a second too.
Yeah.
It's like, what piece of literature has existed for this long? Like, I really don't know.
Yeah. I mean, like, even if we're gonna go like Beowulf, which is one of the oldest English recordings of anything, like we found like a copy of that, like a fragmented copy, and that's the only reason like we have it.
Yeah.
And so I think with all this being said, it might sound like we're diminishing the godness of the Bible, like, oh man, it's written by humans who were using their own metaphorical context, and what wasn't written at the time that it was actually happening. So maybe they changed some details or whatever. Actually, though, all with the preservation that we have and that time for refinement, there's space for God to enter in and weave in his truth into this story. And that's, that is a subjective thing to say about it. But that's where I come from in this. And I will say that I think we have this book the way that we have it by God's plan. And that's, again, this is my opinion. But I think there are human, we'll call them errors, but human judgments that are being used. Humans wrote it. They chose to include things. They chose not to include things. They chose to edit things. They chose not to edit things. But I think with the time that we have and the amount of variance that we can come up with on each scripture, like, I think the reason that happened is because it was God's plan to give us what we have.
Yeah, and I would say I have a much more practical, or that's not even the right word.
Yeah.
Just like I'm very realist when it comes to the Bible.
Yeah.
And I think what we did during like the first portion of our conversation was like enhance and bring light to the humanization of it all.
Yeah.
Like it is a human work. Like even when we say it's God breathed or like it's influenced by the Holy Spirit or God, like it was still a person that had these oral traditions that wrote these things down, or people. But when you look at the fact that it still exists today, and it's the most popular book in the freaking world, and that this is the first of many books that has, like, I don't care who you are, it has a common thread throughout the entire thing, whether it's using characters or design patterns or whatever. It makes that fact of humanization make the God part of it even more freaky. Because it's like, we just took a big 1,000-piece puzzle and we shook it up because we're a bunch of stupid humans and we threw it up in the air, and then we waited 1,000 years and we came back and it was all just perfectly put together. Like, it's an amazing... To humanize it actually makes it even more amazing that it exists in the forms it does today.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I agree too. And one of the things I love about it being a work God breathed, but through humanity, is that it really shows us how valuable God thinks humans are, and that he wants us to be a part of his kingdom every step of the way through the Bible. Like he could have made this on tablets and sent it down or whatever, but he chose to use humans to do it. And like with all of our flaws, he still created this amazing work.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Like, I think John in his gospel was really meditating on this fact when he calls Jesus the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, was God, and it came and dwelt among us as a human flesh. Jesus is 100% God, 100% human.
Yeah.
And is somehow like a beautiful combination of those two things. And I think that's what the Bible, its authors believed it was, and I think what it is a entirely divine yet entirely human work in a way that we just can't necessarily understand how that works. But that's also what we see being demonstrated in Genesis 1 through 11, which I think is why it's important, is that we have these different creation stories that tell us this is the story of the thing called creation that is totally God and also like totally human as well.
Yeah, so I feel like in this conversation we've kind of fleshed out where we want to go.
Yeah.
We've mentioned Genesis 1 and 2, and then Genesis 1 through 11 a couple of times. So can you give us like an overview of what those two are? Like, you don't have to go through the whole story, but like give us some training wheels there, so that, because I think that those will be kind of the chunks that we'll go through, not like in the next 2 episodes, but like in the next 300.
Yeah. So the reason I pick out Genesis 1 through 11, well, first of all, it's not me picking it out just on a whim, like based on my own research or whatever.
It's
like
pretty common.
It
chunk.
is, yeah. It's a common denotation. The universal story. That's what that book is all about. It's like trying to. Its argument is basically that Genesis 1 through 11 is the universal story of humanity. That no matter what culture you go to, they're all telling this story
Right.
in their own way.
Right. They might have different names or different locations or times, but it's all the same thing.
Yeah, and so what he would argue, and again, kind of going back to this point, is every culture ever has been trying to figure out who are we, where do we come from, why are we here, like what are we doing, is there something besides us? If so, does it care about us? Did it make us?
Right.
All those questions.
And if not, like, why am I me?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what?
Exactly. And so Genesis 1 through 11 is Israel's version of that story. It's the who are we? Why are we here? Is there someone else? Is there a higher being? What do they have to do with us?
And once again, these are questions that I ask myself in 2020, and I would probably use different language to
Yeah.
describe.
Yeah.
So don't put your expectations of existence or the fourth dimension or
Right.
whatever, Harry, onto this text when we go through it.
Yeah, exactly. And, like, Genesis seeks to answer some of those, but not all of those.
Yes.
Like, it's not going to tell me, like, I shouldn't look to Genesis if I'm trying to figure out which job to pursue. Genesis does like that. Genesis doesn't care about that.
No.
So, like, don't try to read into things into Genesis that it's not trying to explain.
Yeah.
Which we'll talk about later. I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, so Genesis 1 and 2 answer basically, among other things, where did we come from and who are we?
How did it start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where did we come from and who
Where do
are
we go?
Yeah, where did we come from?
Cotton
Cotton Eye Joe.
Joe. We'll see you guys next week.
It's been a great episode. Outro. Okay, so yeah, where do we come from, and who are we? Those are the questions of Genesis 1 and 2, and there have been other answers in many other cultures, and most of those ancient answers are, well, in the beginning was either a primordial god or multiple primordial gods, and man, they duked it out. They duked it out, and eventually one reigned supreme because he ate the other ones.
Sliced off its head and poured its blood, which
Yeah.
became the rain in the oceans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when they were pouring out the blood of the gods onto the trampled earth, that was the battlefield, like humans arose from that.
Yes.
And the most conquering gods said, you know what? Your blood created those things, so they're yours. Like, make them your slaves. And so that's what we are. We're the slaves made from blood, and so, like, the gods love blood. That's why we sacrifice and go to war. You know, like...
What brutal cultures, man.
Yeah.
Like, you think, like, we think things are... I mean, things aren't great right now. I'm not saying the world's perfect. But, my gosh, for that to be, like, an origin story that's very common.
Yeah.
Like, blood, war, death. Like, man, what brutal, brutal places.
And it wouldn't surprise you as to why those groups of humans thought that way. It's like, I'm literally here to kill and conquer, you know?
Kill or
Yeah.
be killed, man.
Yeah.
And this one has a much different,
Yes.
much different
A
point.
much different take, but using all of the same symbols and images. So
Right.
this one says, way back then, whenever then was, God,
A long, long time
yes,
ago.
God created, he created the place above us, the stars and the skies, and he created the earth where we live, and he did it just out of word. He just breathed it out. He spoke it into being. There's no conflict there. It was this mind that just has the ability to speak creation. And that's what happened. And you know what? He created light, and he created the sun and the moon and the stars. And you know what? you guys in your other cultures, you would say that the sun and the moon were two of those deities that were clashing, or the stars
The
were
sun
those,
god,
yeah,
the moon
or the
god.
darkness was this clashing thing, or the oceans was one of the gods. Actually, God created all those
There
things.
is one God.
Yeah.
There might be something underneath him. That's to debate. But
Dude,
there
that's-
is one God that created.
That's so progressive.
Yeah. Yes. Especially at
It's
the
like
time.
actually like all these things aren't gods. Like they're just things created by God.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's like, dude,
Yeah.
no, like anything that I can't touch is a god. What are you talking about?
We actually are honing in on maybe the most important, and I'm glad that we did a lot of
Yeah.
backtracking to get to this, but maybe the most important theme about Genesis is that it establishes one almighty, all-powerful,
Right.
omnipresent, omniscient God.
Yeah, and he created all of those other things that human cultures have deified and worshipped. And
Right.
now I'll also say, it does say like the sun and the moon and the stars, he gave them over to govern the day
Yeah.
and the night. And so I think even in the Israelite mind, there is truth to the deification of these things, whether it's their actual real spiritual beings or their metaphorical representations of
There's power to
spiritual
them.
power.
Yeah.
Yes. But the point is that the sun and the moon, or the spiritualness behind those are important and they're real. However, they are subservient and, or at least have been given their authority
Yeah.
by God.
Going back to your Green Party metaphor,
Right.
to explain a metaphor, like this is a unifying creation narrative. Like it's taking the 6,000 others that existed, picking parts from each of them, and then making its final point at the end. Like it's not saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. This is right. It's saying you're actually probably all right in some certain respect. I just want to tell you the main thing, and that is there is one Almighty God.
Yeah.
I think though it's pretty brash in establishing like God's dominance over all these.
Yeah.
Like even the beginning where God's hovering over the waters, like the waters were an incredibly powerful force.
Right.
Like, I forget if that's Baal or not, but like there's some cultures that like revered water so much. So like God have like from the beginning, He's establishing dominance over that. It's like look at how powerful. Like yes, like the sun and the moon, all these things are powerful, but they're nothing compared to the one that made them.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, it's cool.
So Genesis 1 and 2, the unifying creation narrative.
Yeah.
One creation narrative to rule them all.
Yeah, and so what this is saying too is when Egypt's like, who are our gods? These are our gods.
Yeah.
And Canaanites like, who are our gods? These are our gods. And then Israel's like, who is our God? This is our God.
Right.
And in the beginning there was wildness and chaos, and there was wasteland and nothingness. Our God is the one who brings order and who brings fruitfulness to those things. And so anywhere that you see order, that's our God. Anywhere you see fruitfulness, that's our God. You know what? The war and the chaos, that might be your God, But our God created the things that allow you to have those anyway. But so then the question is, well, if our God is the ultimate power, the authority, and He creates order and life, well, we know that there's more than just order and life. So why? Why is there that? And that's where we get to
Gen
that
3.
second part. Well, even in Gen 1 and Gen 2, Gen,
like you're talking about
first
Pokemon.
gen and second gen.
Talking about Pokemon right now?
Even in Genesis 1 and 2, like I said, so we have God gave authority to govern the day, He gave that to the sun, and to govern the night, He gave that to the moon, and then to govern the earth, because those are the heavens area that we're talking about, the skies. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, so then we have this delineation. Well, He's given governance of the heavens to the sun, moon, and stars, and He's given governance of the earth and all that's in it to human. And that's where we show up in verse 6, and it says, your charge is to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth and to subdue it. And that subdue is the govern aspect, So you're supposed to populate the earth. You're supposed to bring more goodness than what I've already... this is the God that creates order and creates fruitfulness. And then our job is to be fruitful. So we're supposed to take that order, which is the governing part, and take the fruitfulness and do more of that.
God's the CEO, right? And he made the senior vice president of the sky, the senior vice president of the sea, and then he made us the senior vice presidents of the earth.
Yeah, and we did a perfect job, and
for like
that's
10
what the Bible's
seconds.
about.
Yeah,
We've never messed up, and
yeah.
we're the best in company history.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then it calls us his image. So his representation. We are his representatives here on earth. So God creates all this stuff. He gives the sky representatives that are supposed to just continue ruling the way he designed it to. Mm-hmm. And then he gives the earth to the humans, which are his representatives on earth that are intended to continue representing him here on earth. So then that's another just big claim right there.
Right.
Because again, with the other contexts, there were representatives of the gods in the other, Egyptian, Canaanite, Babylonian things, but
Pharaoh and but this is probably where you're getting to, but it's only a couple people.
Right.
This is saying humans in general are made in God's image, which was of all the statements we've made, even like the one God one, like that was probably the most brash. Like everyone was just like
equalizer.
Yeah, everyone reading that was like, wait a minute. Yeah, because like a lot of the Egyptian or Babylonians or whoever was reading this at the time, they were freaking slaves. Like they were.
Sure.
That was the majority of the population.
And it's not even. It's not even men. It's humanity in general. It's not even adults.
Man and woman.
Like holy cow.
Yeah, he created them, male and female.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is Genesis 1:27. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them.
Yeah. So whereas 2020 Harry reads that and he's just like, meh. Like somebody way back when reading that was like, what? We're hearing that.
Yeah.
It melted their minds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So God created representations of himself designed to be the authority here on earth. And guess what, Egyptians? It's not just your pharaoh. Mm-hmm. Guess what, Babylonians? It's not just your king. It's every man and woman ever made. We're all designed to be that image.
And then, just to touch on it, to Chris's facetious comment, we do a terrible job. We are the worst senior vice presidents ever because we screw it up immediately, and thus kicks off after 1 and 2.
And this is probably getting too much into it, but the main difference between us and the other senior VPs is that we have choices in what we want to do.
Right.
And this gets into whether or not you believe in free will or not, but I personally do, and I think that's why we messed up. Like we were given the choice to do what we wanted to do. And depending on how you think about the son, I don't think the son has a choice.
Yeah. I think that's
a philosophical question, but no, I don't
that would be something that I think even the Israelites debated on about how all that works. So we get into chapter 2 and another similar statement made about mankind. And the reason I think that we can be confident that this is a story about all humanity, the reason that we can be confident that this is the universal story is because of some of the words that they choose to use. So when they create man, he creates him and calls him Adam or Adam.
Adam.
Yes, and earlier it was shown that the man in Genesis 2 is seen as being taken, like a dirt taken and breathed divine breath
into his nostrils.
Yeah, so a dirt earthling that has divine spirit.
Yeah.
And then they're given the name Adam, which just means, it sounds very similar to dirt, but also is just the Israelite word for humanity.
Yeah. Man, that I just never thought of earthling in that way.
Yeah.
That's like the perfect word for it.
It is, yeah.
Because it's like made of earth.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And then woman is made in a different way than in Genesis 1, but probably because it's demonstrating a different thing, and she's called Eve, which just means like life. So we have humanity and life, human life. So who are we talking about here? Human life.
All y'all.
Making it pretty. That's the other thing too. It's like so many times, and like this isn't as easy as like go get guidance, but so many times when I'm reading the Old Testament, I'm like, why can't I speak Hebrew? Like I wish I like. Well, we're just scratching the surface of just like, oh, Adam means like Eve means this. There is so much that we miss. Like that's why I love the Bible Project, because he's like, oh yeah, and this word means this, and I'm like, really wish I would have known that. Like and I'm not saying you need to devote your lives to learning Hebrew, a dead language, but
I mean, and for us, like nowadays, if this is something that interests you, like if you're reading something in Genesis or whatever, and you're not really sure what it is, just look it up.
Look up the
like
word.
It's all over the internet, and like names are a great place to start.
Yeah.
Like if you see a name and you want to know more about that person,
Yeah.
like look up the name, because in Hebrew, it's probably a characteristic of that.
One of my favorite is in the Joshua story. There's Achan who screws everything up.
Okay.
And his name means trouble.
Trouble. There you go.
It's like, if I would have read that book from the beginning, it's like, oh yeah,
right.
And I'm going to introduce this character. His name is Trouble. I'd be like, oh, like I feel like he's going to do
Gotta
something
look out
stupid.
for that.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Names are super important. So we get Adam and Eve. Human life is given authority, but yeah, they're given the full stewardship authority that God would say, and it's basically like, hey, rule this the right way. And the way we know that this is your option is because of these two trees that are given to us in the center of the garden. So, yeah, they're created. Human life is created in this special place that God has set aside called Eden, and it's a place of fruitfulness and abundance. All the things that Genesis 1 said that God is. Like, this is a God-filled place.
yes,
And in the
this
middle,
is where he lives.
yes, in the middle is this tree that just outpours life, and then next to it is this tree that allows humanity to, or allows the eater of this tree to know good and bad. So, no. Yeah, it's interesting. I think one key to understanding this part is that word know. The knowledge of good and evil, as we would typically call it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
That should be a teaser. We're getting into.
Yeah.
I feel like Genesis 1 and 2. That's where we should go next.
And well, a preface to that, regardless of whether or not you think that is literal or metaphor, we're going to come to the same conclusion. So, like, you can absolutely believe all of this is completely literal, and there are many scholars that do. That's fine. But it's still telling a story, right? Yeah. It's still leading us somewhere.
And I don't think we're going to comment on.
No, I'm giving people the freedom to know
the literalism or the completely metaphor.
Right.
We're not going to fall on that spectrum at all.
No,
we're just going to read it. Yeah.
And I don't know that anybody should 100% fall on either side.
Right.
I mean, if you fall on either, that's totally fine. But like, it's okay to not know. But it's also like, it's okay to read it as literal, but also to go, I believe this happened, but God's still telling me something through it.
Okay, well, so then we are going to fall on the spectrum, and it's not going to be on one of the extremes. It's just going to be somewhere in the middle, and we have no idea where somewhere in the middle is because we don't know. Yeah. All we have is this text.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, part of the Genesis 1 through 11 point is to say, this is a story that speaks to every human everywhere, no matter what culture you're in. Now, the rest of it, we're just going to tell our Israel story. But remember, this is a human story for everyone everywhere that applies to everyone. So even though we're going to zoom in on this guy named Abraham starting in chapter 12 and talk just about his family, this is, again, Genesis 1 through 11. This is your story.
Universal story.
This is the universal story. So I think that's why Genesis 1 through 11 is important, is it sets up this arc, this narrative where it's like, okay. And so I think we'll tease the specifics, but get to the arc, which is there is this God that created everything, and he orders it and makes it fruitful and amazing, and he gives authority to these other beings, spiritual beings and human beings, and they have authority to rule. They take that authority and they rule, but they do it in their own way that's not a partnership with God. And so God allows that, and it gets worse and it gets worse because God's allowing them to rule on their own judgment, and it's not great judgment. And eventually it gets to the point where every single thought of everyone ever is a bad thought that's purposed for badness. But God is faithful to his creation, not only humanity, but to all the earth and all of creation. And so God is going to allow the creation to go into chaos, to be covered by that chaotic, crazy water, but he's going to provide a way out, and he's going to continue. He's going to create new creation out of that, and that's the story. God creates. He's epic. He partners with humanity. We suck. We mess it up, but God is faithful to his promise to deliver us out from there, and he's not going to let us climb higher than we are allowed to go, but he is going to enter into a relationship with us that is permanent. And then that's what Genesis 12 through 50 exposes
over and over and over.
In an over and over way, but honing in on one family and how he's going to do it with that family.
Yeah. I think that's really good. And I think the only thing I would add is that, yes, it's about like bringing us out of this chaos, but really it's about the restoration towards the way things started.
Yeah.
So it's about bringing us back
to
and,
Eden,
and help and us being a part of all that.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Exactly. Awesome. Yeah. Starting it over with the goodness, but in a way that humans are partnering in the right way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So that is the intro to Genesis.
Yeah, we have to make this episode absolutely necessary before people listen to any of the others, because I feel like next time we're going to come in hot on Genesis 1 and 2, and people are going to be like, what is happening?
How about them trees?
Yeah. We vomit everywhere just thinking about it.
So, yeah, Genesis, the universal story of human life everywhere as told by the Israelites in their ancient context.
That should be the title.
As discussed
those
by
Genesis stuff, yeah.
3 Americans.
Yeah.
As discussed by 3 21st century Americans.
Go.
Males. White.
On the couch.
Shout out to Canyon Coffee Roasters for fueling every one of our conversations. If you are only listening, you don't see it, but we are drinking a cup of Canyon every time we talk together. Thanks to John Jones Project and Clink, who are making the music that you hear in the background. Thank you for making awesome stuff that we get to share with the people that are listening to our podcast. And thank you guys for tuning in. And always feel free to let us know if you have questions or things you want to talk about. Yeah, or if you want to be on the show, we'd love to have you as well. All right, thanks. We'll see you next time.